荧幕前的观众朋友，大家午安，大家好，我是外贸协会陈婉如，欢迎大家来到疫后市场学的线上研讨会，很高兴再次与大家在空中相见。今天的时空呢，将带领大家来到英国以及美国，从英美两国的再生能源发展，来看看我们未来的储能的新商机。那当然呢，我们也希望各位能够在活动开始前呢，能够帮我们先分享、按赞以及订阅我们的贸协 YouTube 频道，并且要记得开启小铃铛哦。贸协疫后市场学从8月到9月都有相当多精彩的场次，千万不要错过了。那当然，假使各位观众呢有任何的问题，都欢迎能够在荧幕的右手边的聊天区留下您的问题。那在活动开始前呢，先让我们欢迎外贸协会的叶明水秘书长来为我们说几句话。欢迎叶秘书长。
各位企业先进及贵宾，大家好。政府将绿电及再生能源列为台湾6大核心战略产业之一，就是期许台湾未来成为亚太绿能中心。在去年海洋风场成功运转后，吸引国际开发商像德国的达德能源、安能、新加坡易山能源及丹麦沃旭能源、哥本哈根基础建设基金、加拿大大北陆电力等来台投资，加上台湾太阳能产业链完整，接下来台湾在绿电供应无虞，再生能源稳健发展，将可协助更多像台积电一样的指标性企业加入 RE100， 也就是全球绿电倡议组织，使用100%的绿电，成功的协助我商进入品牌大厂的绿色供应链。而使用再生能源发电的热潮，也会触动再生能源储能系统的发展，整合再生能源分散式的发电，提供干净、可存放、可调度以及可控制又稳定的能源供给。这将会是未来全球绿色风潮中不可或缺的一项关键系统设备。美国再生能源发展有明确的政策，因此带动产业发展，例如美国纽约及加州分别订定2040年及2045年达到100%使用干净能源，这也让美国成为台湾储能设备第1大出口国。未来贸协也会协助企业开发美国主力市场。此外，英国例行洁净成长政策，再生能源比重不断的提高，2019年使用再生能源比例达到39%，建置离岸风电装机容量也成为全球第1。今年受疫情封城的影响，英国在4到6月期间创下超过2个多月，也就是67天没有使用燃煤发电。在再生能源的应用规划上，相信会是各国学习的对象。今天贸协特别邀请到美国储能协会副总经理 Jason Burwen 以及英国再生能源协会政策法规总监 Rebecca Williams， 分享再生能源及储能系统解决方案与商机，希望借专家提供的一手市场及产业讯息，协助企业布局未来。谢谢大家。
全球受到疫情的影响，再生能源虽然遇到了许多挑战，但也有转机。为了协助大家了解英美的市场，本次呢十分荣幸邀请到英国以及美国2位重量级的讲师。首先呢是美国储能协会副总裁 Jason Burwen， 将重点分析美国储能政策以及未来市场的发展趋势。 再来呢是英国再生能源协会政策法规总监 Rebecca Williams， 将探讨储能系统以及能源转型的最新趋势。接下来呢，我们希望呢能够先邀请美国储能协会的讲师。Let's welcome Mr. Burwen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Burwen. I'm the Vice President of Policy for the U.S. Energy Storage Association. I'm pleased to be with you today to talk about business opportunities in energy storage here in the United States. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the U.S. Energy Storage Association is the national trade association in the United States representing the entire value chain of the energy storage industry. And so we have technology manufacturers, vendors of components, system integrators, developers, EPCs, and then, of course, the independent power producers, utilities, and large end users that are operating these assets, as well as folks in consulting, finance. I myself have been the vice president of policy at the Energy Storage Association now for 5 years and have led the industry's federal, wholesale market, and state policy engagements. I'll be pleased to share with you a bit of the landscape here regarding energy storage business opportunities. Next slide, please. So my hope is in today's presentation to give you an overview of the present market for grid energy storage in the United States, talk about some of the larger trends and key drivers for the U.S. energy storage market, and then review leading markets and states, the opportunities that are there for folks who are entering the energy storage market. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the U.S. market overall. Next slide. This is a map. It's a little out of date because the data is a little old, but it gives you a sense of where particularly battery energy storage projects are now installed on grids across the United States. You see a few different clusters across the sort of mid-Atlantic, Midwest, which is in the PJM regional market, in Texas, in the ERCOT regional market, and in Southern California, a large cluster of battery storage projects that were installed after the Aliso Canyon gas facility failure, where batteries were used to make up the capacity. So a lot of these projects, this is sort of looking backwards in time. These are the business models and cases that have penciled early on, which have tended to be shorter duration frequency regulation, such as in PJM and ERCOT, and also the emergence of more longer durations, several hours in Southern California. We'll get into some of these trends and projects in a little bit, but next slide, please. Overall, we in the energy storage industry have installed in the United States now just over 1.5 gigawatt of battery energy storage, representing approximately 3 gigawatt hours cumulatively. And based on the projections of Wood Mackenzie, with which ESA is in partnership, we expect that overall market size to grow quite significantly, in large part driven by both longer durations of energy storage and a significant number of utility contracted assets expected to come online in the early 2020s, which accounts for the fairly significant level shift in the amount of storage deployments expected. I think it's important to note when you look at this slide, in addition to, of course, the overall change in the levels, the colored bars here represent your behind the meter segments, which at present remain about a third of overall installed energy storage capacity. While they will be a smaller share going forward, nonetheless, they will remain a significant part of the U.S. energy storage industry. Next slide, please. This gives you a sense of what was happening regarding overall deployments quarter on quarter. You can see sort of the level again of activity has shifted quite significantly over the last year and a half for both front of meter and behind the meter, and gives you a sense also of some of the variability because some of these are large chunks of capacity coming online. Next slide, please. When we look behind the meter in the non-residential market, you've seen some significant growth here, California, Massachusetts, and New York being the main places where these commercial and industrial customers are installing energy storage. And incidentally, those are also the leading markets for energy storage overall. So we'll be talking about them a bit later. Next slide, please. And then in the residential market, really this is driven primarily by California and Hawaii, where we see significant installs. And in the residential sector, my understanding is that most of these installs are solar paired energy storage, in part taking advantage of the current advantageous tax crediting available for folks installing solar and storage together. Next slide, please. When you look forward in time, and one way to do that is looking at interconnection requests, that is requests by developers who want to connect their projects and be operational on regional grids. You can see, this is again a little bit older data, you can see that the way in which queues have grown is quite significant across the United States. I do want to note that in addition to, of course, significant increases in the amount of battery grid storage capacity being proposed for interconnection, a significant amount of that is being proposed now as hybrid projects, that is co-located and integrated with generation resources like wind and solar. We'll touch on that a little bit more, but again, this is sort of a data point to understand. If you look forward at 2020 queues, you'll find that these numbers continue to increase secularly. Next slide, please. In terms of the investment side of this, outside of just project finance, there are a number of companies that have started up in this space. And so VC has been moving into the energy storage industry. I don't think what's reflected exactly here in this chart from Wood Mackenzie is also where private equity is coming in part to help move some of these different companies that are newer on the scene into more of a stable institutional position. Next slide, please. It helps to know who's in the landscape here in the United States regarding energy storage technologies. Certainly, once you start looking up the supply chain, this is a very international set of companies. So some of these names are not surprising. And I think that, while you're getting sort of the full range of technologies here, certainly traditional lithium-ion battery technologies are the predominant supply for the United States, representing in the, I think, above 98% of installed capacity over the last several years. Next slide, please. The folks who are bringing these projects together and putting them on the grid, I think, is perhaps more specific to the United States. Again, some of these names may be familiar international names, but a lot of these are folks who are working either in just North America or just the United States, or have that as their predominant focus. So it pays to get familiar with who are the main vendors for power electronics, who are the system integrators that are leading in this space. The EPCs, particularly important, of course, making good relationships with engineering, procurement, and construction companies that will ultimately build these projects if your company does not do so yourself. And of course, who you're selling these to is going to matter as well. But recognize that if you're not yourself a developer, it will be very important for you to get to know some of the lead developers in this space. So I hope you find this brief and non-exhaustive roadmap to the different companies in the space useful. Next slide, please. So another thing to understand here is that there are several different ways to sell energy storage projects in the United States. The, in some ways, simplest way to do so is to participate directly in wholesale markets, which you can do yourself as an asset manager, or you can sell, of course, to an independent power producer or some other asset manager to operate the asset, providing energy, ancillary services, and where markets allow, capacity services. And those are payments that are market cleared and market based, highly transparent, but also varying quite a lot. Certainly, if you're in a behind the meter environment, just end user acquisition is clearly the main way you're going to deal with this. A lot of that, of course, is still purchases, but there are folks who are working in lease models as well to maintain, if not ownership, or if not operational control, at least ownership of the assets to potentially be able to use them in flexible manners, as we're seeing sort of pioneered by some of the virtual power plant models. And then there are non-market contracts, particularly relevant when you're working with a regulated investor-owned utility or potentially a municipal or public power agency or a rural electric cooperative, the three main kinds of grid operators you would be contracting with. The table below just gives you a sense that there's many different ways to set up contracts for energy storage. So there's no one way to do this. And it's best to make sure that you're familiar with the different ways in which you can sell these assets to plan your business model around it. Next slide, please. I think another thing also folks should be very aware of is safety codes and standards when you're developing projects in the United States. Each locality, which is we call an authority having jurisdiction, will be in different states of code adoption. Most places in the United States have not had experience permitting battery energy storage projects. So it really pays to pay attention to codes and standards, to answer questions, to be prepared to deal with the questions that are coming at you. And I just want to note that there are new standards that have been promulgated through NFPA 855. Adoption will be very uneven. Of course, there are other US standards and model codes, some of which are outlined here for you. And next slide, please. I just also want to make sure folks are aware that on ESA's website, we have public resources available to help you with understanding operational safety in the United States. Okay. With that out of the way, just going to give a high level of US market trends. Next slide, please. The next slide. Obviously, this is the main trend. The continued decrease in battery storage installed costs is driving a lot of this activity in the United States. We've seen a little bit of hiccups here in terms of tariffs, which are affecting some pricing, but ultimately, we still consider this on a secular decline. Next slide, please. That is leading to sizes and durations of units rising, as I noted, a lot of shorter duration, smaller projects characterizing most of the build previously. And now we're seeing many of the utility contracted assets being in the hundreds of megawatts, and again, multiple hours of duration. What that means is there's this shift in how folks are thinking about storage. You still have some folks who are grid operators who think about it more as just a grid stabilizing resource, but really, I think most folks are focused on capacity, either system capacity or local capacity for the transmission or distribution network. Next slide, please. The way that'll oftentimes be reflected is in the utilities planning and procurement processes. This is probably one of the biggest changes in the US energy storage industry in the last several years is the entrance of utilities as customers in a significant manner. So integrated resource plans or IRPs are a good place to go to understand what different utilities are planning over the next 10 to 20 years. And you'll see that there are a number of utilities that have selected storage in their plans on a pure economic basis that should inform their procurement plans going forward. We are now seeing procurements from regulated utilities at gigawatt hour scales. And I've listed a few of them down below here, but sort of the highest single procurement was recently a 770 megawatt procurement from Southern California Edison. But we're seeing still many utilities doing things in the 200s, 300s, 400s of megawatts in one go. So it pays attention, it pays to keep an eye on the RFP landscape here in the United States, because a lot of these solicitations are really only, again, have happened in the last year or two at most, and there are plenty more to come. Next slide, please. As I noted, system capacity is probably a key market to be focused on for larger project developers, project offers. There's been some amount of market sizing for particularly storage as a peaking capacity done by National Renewable Energy Lab here in the United States. I recommend looking up this study, which tries to give you a sense of different durations of storage and what they can provide economically, or not economically, sorry, what they can provide technically in terms of duration to contribute to reliability. This can be a helpful guide to where to spend your time developing market relationships. Next slide, please. And certainly what a lot of folks in the planning space are looking at is this kind of comparison, seeing how quickly battery storage projects are competing with simple cycle combustion turbines. which tend to have been relied on as the main source of peaking power until fairly recently. Next slide, please. These are just some examples of sort of peak capacity battery storage projects that are online or coming online, and some announcements of them, just to make clear that this is real, and this is where I think a lot of the excitement is in the United States. Next slide, please. Also significant, in addition to system capacity, as I noted, a lot of distribution utilities are thinking about the extent to which battery storage projects can be used to extend the life of their existing electric infrastructure. There's a big conversation on resilience here in the United States, and we're seeing that those two things are coming together, where you have utilities that are implementing these kinds of projects for both infrastructure, capability extension, and resilience. In some states, increasing the hosting capacity of circuits to allow more distributed energy resources is an important policy goal. And ultimately, the trends of increasing electrification in transportation and potentially to follow in heating and industrial processes augurs well for folks who may be looking at storage as a way to buffer demands on the grid. Next slide, please. And this is just to give you sort of, again, a little bit of a market sizing. Obviously, not all of this capital expenditure can be replaced by energy storage, probably only a fraction of it. But it gives you a sense that sort of one of the key stories in the United States right now is that for grid operators, utilities, munis, co-ops, the part of their business that is expanding is not on the generation side, it's on the transmission and the distribution capital expenditure side. So that may be a good place to start trying to focus your business model. Next slide, please. And I just note that there are a number of states that are starting to look at opening up the planning of distribution systems, which in the United States has traditionally been a very closed process without competition or much oversight. The reason being that it was just assumed that you would have a conventional set of wires resources, and that battery storage in particular is changing that paradigm quite a bit and making a new conversation occur on the extent to which it can be a part of the distribution system. It's very uneven in the United States and still very early days in some respects, the extent to which different states are directing their distribution utilities to undertake open distribution planning. We'll talk about that a little bit in New York. Next slide, please. And then these are just some examples, just so you can understand what these projects look like in the United States. I won't dwell on them, though. Next slide, please. Certainly, as electrification of transportation proceeds, there's an expectation that this will also create an opportunity for energy storage. And I particularly want to emphasize the heavy-duty vehicle side of this. And as you can see below, ferries, trucks, these are the kinds of loads that need to be DC fast charged and present significant challenges to current electric distribution infrastructure. Next slide, please. So mostly as a hypothesis right now, this is not a well-developed business model. But nonetheless, there are folks who are beginning to work out how to integrate storage as a part of electrification of transportation, focused primarily on buffering the impacts of DC fast charging on local distribution systems. If distribution systems need to be upgraded significantly to take on massive electric vehicle loads, that may actually make the costs of transportation electrification too high to justify for some public budgets. And so this can be a real win-win solution to be able to explore. And we're aware of certainly some companies like EVgo and others that are beginning to work with trying to put these on-site storage projects in their charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, a trend of hybridization of storage with generation resources. We're seeing now that over half of new interconnection requests that include storage are in hybrid configurations with primarily solar, but also wind and gas generation as well. And a lot of that is happening in the Western United States, primarily in the California Independent System Operator footprint. But it's also following in places like Texas, ERCOT market, Southwest Power Pool, which is sort of the central part of the United States. And I think it's important to recognize that for, again, folks who are thinking about their business model for doing storage in the United States, these kinds of hybrid resource integrations are increasingly preferred by lots of large developers for a variety of reasons, but most significantly from a business model case, a hedge and an ability to make sure that these assets remain flexible, as well as to overcome potential, again, challenges associated with interconnection and market participation that have yet to be resolved in wholesale market rules. Next slide, please. Our conversations in the United States on resilience have really, I think, taken off in the last 2 years, particularly with public safety power shutoffs in places like California becoming much more commonplace, as well as, of course, continuing devastation from hurricanes. And so you're seeing a lot of storage, particularly in microgrid implementations, gaining interest. That's not the only way it's being done, but certainly this is one of the main ways in which we see the public sector becoming interested in energy storage. And certainly for many customers, they may have a resilience need that it's worth paying attention to outside of the standard cost savings, to think of this more as an insurance product as well. Next slide, please. And then lastly, of course, the trend of clean energy integration. We now have 8 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico have statutes requiring 100% clean energy by a certain future date. And presuming that a significant amount of that is met with renewables, the integration of renewables, the famous duck curve here presented for you as well, is creating its own business case for energy storage. I would not suggest that this is necessarily the sole business that you can finance an energy storage project on at present. However, this will be of rising value, particularly in states that start to hit significant curtailments of wind and solar due to deliverability challenges. Next slide, please. Do want to remind folks that there are other ways to get flexibility beyond just battery storage. That said, it is certainly something that has the least regulatory lift insofar as you don't need to change a whole lot of rules compared to a lot of these other options for system flexibility, and the costs continue to come down significantly. Just a quick review of policy drivers. Next slide, please. We've seen now 7 states implement state deployment targets of varying levels and stringency. These account for now 11 gigawatts or so of energy storage deployment over the next 15 years. And these states that have storage targets are definitely a good place to stay focused, given that you have a long-term investment signal and a place that you're able to potentially do business over a longer term. Next slide, please. Another policy driver, of course, are incentive programs. We've seen over $1 billion in incentives be put into storage. Much of that is in behind-the-meter storage, so things that customers themselves can take advantage of, but not all. New York, for example, their incentives for their Market Acceleration Bridge Incentive Program refer to front of meter as well as behind the meter. Massachusetts Clean Peak Standard is sort of a first of a kind program that allows you to get paid for charging and discharging your storage wherever it is on the grid at certain times. So obviously there's a lot of innovation potentially to come in this space in terms of state program design. And of course, the federal investment tax credit is available when you pair storage with solar, although that has now stepped down to the 22% level from its original 30% level. Next slide, please. States are reforming utility planning in some instances and driving more of this examination of energy storage as a part of grid portfolios and looking forward into the future. So it's worth paying attention to places where those reforms are being made. Next slide, please. And for folks who are working at behind-the-meter storage, changes to interconnection are going to be quite critical in order to enable that business model to succeed. We've seen a handful of states actually take on updates to interconnection to allow better allow behind-the-meter storage to access the grid, but there's still a lot of work to do across the United States. Next slide, please. Our wholesale regional markets now are open to distributed energy storage resources participating in them, which is quite a new and interesting opportunity for the future. There are a lot of folks who are going to figure out how to bring in projects as small as 100 kilowatts to participate directly in markets, which opens up opportunities to participate dually in wholesale markets as well as provide local end user or distribution system services. So that's an emerging business model that is being pioneered right now, as well as distributed aggregations in these wholesale markets that Order 841 unlocks. Next slide, please. Then lastly, at the federal level, there's some policy drivers. I mentioned the investment tax credit. Of course, we've seen increasing federal investments in research and development. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is driving rules on the capacity valuation of storage. So there's a lot of things going here, but of course, challenges as well. The present public health emergency, tariffs, lack of administrative guidance and legislative deadlock are going to be reasons why states are going to continue being primary drivers for a lot of these business models and market development. Next slide, please. I know that we have very little time left, so rather than march you through each one of these states, I'm just going to do some very quick highlights, and then that'll allow us to get to the end of our time together. Next slide, please. In California, certainly the state is moving beyond its energy storage targets towards a 100% clean future and recently released its long-term planning that shows nearly 10 gigawatts of new storage needed cumulatively to 2030. So there will be many opportunities in California. Next slide, please. Another thing to bear in mind in California is these new actors, CCAs, community choice aggregators, who are going to be responsible in part for procuring energy storage for resource adequacy, and oftentimes will have more of an interest in behind-the-meter storage to the extent that it's locally in their territories. So do pay attention to CCAs. Next slide, please. A big driver, again, for behind-the-meter storage in California is the self-generation incentive program. This is a significant amount of funds, and I think it's important to understand that that program has been getting updated regularly over time, not just more money being put into it, but also now, for example, higher rates for folks who are employing energy storage for resilience or equity considerations, such as low and moderate income households. You might find incentives there that pay for nearly all of the behind-the-meter storage deployment. So there's a lot of opportunity there if you can get yourself into the sort of application waiting line sooner than later. Next slide, please. In New York, also a state going to 100% clean energy, which has formalized a 3,000 megawatt energy storage target by 2030 and is prioritizing sort of reducing local emissions, which will help, I think, drive some of the New York City area energy storage deployments. Next slide, please. As I mentioned briefly, the Market Acceleration Bridge incentive in New York is available for both front-of-meter and behind-the-meter storage. And this is a significant amount of funds to get the market going in New York. Only a fraction of this has been committed to date. And so, again, there's an opportunity for folks who are able to move soon into the New York market to potentially avail this, as well as some of the funds outside of this incentive program, such as are being provided in Long Island. There may be more to come from NYSERDA as well. Next slide, please. I do want to note that in New York, you are seeing more directed solicitations for what's called non-wires alternatives. That's energy storage as a part of the distribution system. And those solicitations are ongoing through a central portal. Another thing to bear in mind, next slide, please, is that another opportunity for this kind of application is to avail yourself of value of DER tariffs that are now available in parts of New York. These are designed as successors to net energy metering, but they are available to storage plus solar projects. And I recommend that, again, you investigate each utility has its own sort of list of compensation values associated with energy storage participating in its distribution system. Next slide, please. Massachusetts has its Clean Peak Standard, which I referenced, a very novel program that has just been started. This is a program that was finalized only a month ago and is kicking off. So it'll be worth, again, paying attention to those of you who can move quickly to start seeing what the opportunity is here in terms of being able to charge your energy storage in smart manners to be able to get sort of multiplier incentives for time shifting clean energy or being able to hit certain peak periods. Next slide, please. Additionally, in Massachusetts, you have a feed-in tariff program, the SMART program for solar plus storage projects. This program was recently expanded to double its size, and there's a specific incentive adder for solar projects that add storage of varying durations and relative sizing. So again, applications for that second block have opened, and I encourage folks to go find that program and see how they can get involved quickly. Next slide, please. In Massachusetts, also, there's the Connected Solutions program for behind the meter, which is a pay-for-performance peak reduction program. And what's good about this program is that you get a compensation level that's guaranteed for 5 years. So that makes it much easier to finance than your traditional demand response type of program. Again, something we think is worth paying attention to. Next slide, please. Of course, California, New York, and Massachusetts are just the 3 leading states in the United States. There are many other states to pay attention to. I've listed a few that are top of mind for me right now. Virginia with its storage target being developed, Arizona with a high solar penetration and lots of interest in distributed storage, Texas with its pure energy only market and lots of regulatory changes to bring battery storage onto its system, Nevada, which is already partway to its 1,000 megawatt storage target, and many more. There are other regional markets like PJM, MISO, SPP, and ISO New England, where you are seeing folks change rules for storage participation. And as I mentioned, it's important to know who's buying your projects. It's not just investor-owned utilities. Each of public power and electric co-ops, they have different things that they're thinking about, different value propositions, and it's worth getting to know those and investigate those. Next slide. One way to get to know those is to join ESA at our virtual annual conference, which is online and available to anyone across the world, August 24th to 27th of this year. Do come join us. Go to esacon.org and you can see the agenda and the registration there and find a lot of our educational content to help you determine your business and market entry strategy in the United States. Next slide, please. And of course, I encourage those of you who are particularly interested in the United States market, consider also having your company join the U.S. Energy Storage Association, where part of our job is to educate members and make sure that they have access to the information and the networks that are important for doing business here successfully in the United States. I want to thank you all for time I've been able to spend with you today, and I hope you found this presentation particularly helpful. Please don't hesitate to contact me. My information is on the slide here. I'll be happy to try and answer what questions I can. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Burwen. 外贸协会办理一系列的疫后市场学的线上研讨会，从8月到9月，每周四下午3点都有会准时开播，欢迎各位一定要准时锁定我们的频道哦。英国再生能源协会全球超过660个企业会员，包括大型开发商像沃讯能源、德国领先能源公司以及丹麦维斯塔斯等大家耳熟能详的公司。那今天呢，邀请的是协会政策法规总监 Miss Rebecca Williams 为我们介绍英国再生能源市场商机。Let's welcome Miss Williams.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the host, and thank you for having me here today to speak to you. I'm really excited to tell you more about the UK market. So first of all, just to introduce myself, I'm Rebecca Williams. I'm Head of Policy and Regulation at Renewable UK. And Renewable UK are the UK's leading renewables energy association. We have around 400 members who span the entire energy system. So they're both supply chain companies and also some of the biggest developers and utilities in the UK. Our members operate both in the UK and across the world, and they're exporting goods and services to over 37 countries across the renewables and energy services space. We have senior board members who have had long careers in the oil and gas sector as well as the renewables sector, and you'll see there some names from some of the biggest renewable developers globally. We have really good relationships with the UK government. We regularly meet with ministers and the Secretary of State here in the UK, as well as having excellent relationships with the regulators and also other government stakeholders. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavour of who I'm here to speak about today. So I wanted to start by giving you a bit of an overview of what's happened with renewables in general. I was asked to speak on renewables and storage, and I think the situation in the UK at the moment is really interesting because we are absolutely at the forefront of the energy transition globally. And so our market is moving exceptionally fast. And I'll come on to talk about some of the specific characteristics of the UK market that make it a very attractive place to invest in, both from a renewables perspective and also zeroing in on energy storage specifically. So moving on, I think the renewable sector has grown faster than anyone could have predicted. And here at Renewable UK, we often joke about the International Energy Agency and just how wrong they've got renewables forecasts in the past. So this slide just shows the revisions of upward estimates of renewables globally. Moving on, specifically looking at solar, onshore and offshore wind and their cost reductions. So globally, as I'm sure you're aware, we've seen the cost of renewables fall astronomically. And if you look at the UK market specifically, the cost reductions that have been achieved in offshore wind over the last few years have been absolutely extraordinary. So we've gone from more than £100 per megawatt hour down to most recently £39.50 per megawatt hour. So those cost reductions have been achieved through the kind of stable policy framework that I'll come on to talk a bit more about. The next slide just shows the market entrance that we're seeing from the oil and gas sector. And I think the UK is interesting because we've had a very active oil and gas sector headquartered here in Aberdeen in Scotland. And that means that now the oil majors, who all have a kind of handle in the UK market, are really starting to get active. And going forwards in offshore wind, later this year, we'll have the results of the Crown Estate Scotland ScotWind process, which is the seabed leasing process for offshore wind. And as part of that, we expect quite a few floating wind sites to be awarded. We've also got the Crown Estate, which is the English body, because the UK has different devolved nations. The Crown Estate is also running its round 4 tendering process for offshore wind leasing. And we expect many of these oil majors who are clustered in the bottom left-hand corner here to enter the UK market if they've not already done so. It shows you what that looks like and what we've seen in terms of some of those big household names kind of transitioning through to join the renewables and energy services space. So moving on, hopefully that gives you a good flavour of the wider context. So looking specifically at the kind of future of energy supply, because I think the UK, as I was saying, has specific factors that make it a very attractive place to invest, both across the renewables and storage space. And we do have relatively joined up policy making in that we have a centralised government that sets the energy policy across our nations, although planning is a devolved power. So that means that in each of the nations of the UK, so Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England, they have their own ability to set the planning framework, but energy policy at a top level is set by the UK government and is centralised. So looking at some of the specific factors that mean that the UK has very supportive renewables policies. So first of all, in 2008, we agreed with cross-party support, the UK Climate Change Act. And now that's been amended so that there's a target to get to net zero emissions by 2050 at the heart of UK law. And that's something that's obviously very exciting, and we really welcome that. That's also escalated the conversation, the political conversation in the UK about the technologies that we need to get to net zero. So also the UK government has committed to a target of 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and also to enable new floating offshore wind farms. They also are now very proactively looking at onshore wind again. And I think this is really exciting because we then have the building blocks and the different market conditions in place, which mean that renewables will shortly become the backbone of the UK's energy system. So you can see there we also have a target set by the Committee on Climate Change, a recommendation to reach 75 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. So it's not really a question of kind of when this transition will happen anymore in the UK, but just how fast. And something that our members are very focused on is rapid technological innovation. So you can see here some of the sizes of turbines that we've had in the past. And now we're seeing that there's kind of a race to the top in terms of different turbine manufacturers wanting to be the first to make larger and larger turbines. And I think that just means that, you know, the UK has this trusted climate for innovation. It has the policy structure to allow investment, and we're absolutely seeing the benefits of that climate. So just to summarize then, what we're seeing is a renewables-led net zero revolution. And as I said, the last few years have been, you know, we've set record after record for renewable deployment in the UK. We're now around 30% renewables in the UK annually, which is a really exciting, 37% renewables in the UK annually, which is really exciting. Also, I think this means that the market is absolutely being disrupted globally, but also specifically in the UK, and the pace of that disruption is going extremely quickly. So I think that means that there's lots of opportunities as we move forwards. So coming on then to look at markets specifically in the UK. So as I said, the transition in the UK has happened really fast. We've had the Climate Change Act and these specific targets for renewables. We also had a government announcement for the phase out of coal power. And really these things have been made possible through the partnership that industry has had with government over the last few years. So for renewables specifically, we've had the contracts for difference model, which is now kind of globally recognized as a best practice gold standard model. And this provides a contract in private law between a counterparty and between the generator. And what that means is certainty of revenue for the generator and for investors, because you get paid the differential between the strike price and the reference price for the CFD contract. These contracts typically run for 15 years. And really this kind of stability has been part of the reason why the offshore wind costs have dropped quite so much. So again, this is just yet another example of why the UK is a great place to invest in, because not only do we have that high level guarantee from the government in terms of the direction of travel of climate targets and of the energy mix, but we also have the specific mechanisms to put that in place and to drive that technological innovation and drive deployment of renewables. So then looking specifically at renewable technologies. So on offshore wind, we've said that 2025 is going to be a really exciting year in the UK for offshore wind, and we'll see around 20 gigawatts of capacity operating in our waters by then. At Renewable UK, we have an in-house data and analytics service called Project Intelligence. And if any of you want to join Renewable UK after this, we'd be really thrilled to have you on board. You also get access to our market-leading data and analytics service, which tells you exactly what projects are in the UK and globally for offshore wind, and drills down into energy storage as well, separating out battery storage from other kinds of storage and looking at co-located projects and hydrogen. So all the data that I'm showing you is from our own in-house forecasting. And in our forecasts, we see that we will be able to absolutely meet that target of 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, and also get to 92 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. So I think to enable that, just listed some of the factors that we want to see down the outside there. And, for us, that is around ensuring that the CFD regime goes forward, and also looking at things like connection agreements, which are the preserve of both the system operator and the regulator in the UK, Ofgem. And in order to achieve that, we'll also have to see close partnership working with other industries. Just briefly touching on onshore wind here as well. So we now see significant growth in onshore wind, with capacity growing to 26 gigawatts by 2030 and 36 gigawatts by 2050. Some of the factors that will make that happen is around more favourable planning regimes. So looking at other technologies in the UK, so solar is also growing rapidly in the UK, and we see from the Solar Trade Association in the UK, their operational capacity of 27 gigawatts by 2030 of solar, and rising to 40 gigawatts by 2050. So I think across the board, what we're seeing is more and more renewables being deployed, and that's creating the market conditions that are going to make storage really important. And I'll come on to talk about storage in more detail in just a second. Looking at a kind of high level in terms of energy storage, we see at the moment mainly battery storage projects in the pipeline, and we currently have around 10 gigawatts in the UK pipeline. But we're also seeing batteries and vehicle-to-grid, as well as hydrogen storage projects now really ramping up. National Grid, who are the system operator in the UK, the electricity system operator, predict in their net zero scenarios that we'll have 23 gigawatts of storage by 2050, plus then capability from electric vehicles. But implementing the planned network changes and access to markets will be absolutely vital, because without that, we won't be able to see the levels of storage that we need. So moving on. Oops, I've gone a bit too far here. There we go. So again, I want to talk about the kind of conditions that are bringing about the transition in the UK and why these matter for storage. So I think because we have the system where we have the higher level targets and we have the specific policy mechanisms, with storage there are specific policy mechanisms that can be used at the moment. So the electricity system operator, National Grid, operates a balancing services market. There's also specific tenders that are available for things like short-term operating reserve. Then also we have a capacity market, capacity payment structure in the UK, which is to help with security of supply. And so there is an auction every year and then every 4 years ahead. So it's 1 year for 1 year ahead and then for 4 years ahead, which storage is eligible to bid into. And we have seen battery projects have some success in the capacity market. I think the issue is that at the moment we're in this kind of transition period. So we've got a lot of renewables build out happening. We've got a lot of things changing in the market. And I think there's going to be a slight time delay before we get to the exact conditions that are going to then make the price in that market spikier. But this summer has provided a bit of a microcosm of the future, because we've seen very low demand in the UK and also extraordinarily sunny and windy weather. And so that's shown us that on certain days, the price has been relatively spiky and has provided those conditions for investment. The other thing that's happened in the UK is that we have had a change to the planning regime, which means that projects that are more than 50 megawatts are now kind of fast-tracked through the planning system. And I think that's a really interesting and useful development. And we'll start to see far more storage projects come in on the back of that change. So that's a really exciting change, and we just need to wait and see how that comes through the system now. But the other thing that we're trying to secure in the UK are more of these kind of top level signals for the market. So looking across the different sectors of the economy, as I mentioned, the UK has a legally binding target to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And what we would like to see now is that kind of flowing down through into different sectors of the economy. So I think the decarbonisation of road transport and of heat are going to be the two areas that really influence A, how much renewables we need to see online, but B, the levels of storage penetration that we will see. So 60% of the UK's emissions reductions so far have been accounted for by the power sector, so by electricity production. And road transport will obviously be the next big sector to decarbonise. And we've already seen in the UK a rapid uptake of electric vehicles. What we would like to see next is more incentives for electric vehicles and a more strategic approach to things like charging points, etc. But also going to be really important later this year is that the UK government has committed to producing a heat strategy, which will cover how the government intends to decarbonise heat. And I think that's going to be really important, again, to set the tone for how much electrification we will need to see. And then also how that will join up with things like behind the meter storage and storage at DNO level. So we look forward to that strategy arriving. We gather it's going to be later this year. The UK government has also committed to producing an energy white paper, which will come later this year and will set out in more detail the direction they intend to take the energy system in. So there's two key pieces of policy that we can expect. And I think that will hugely help our understanding of the direction of travel in the UK for decarbonisation in general, but also for investment in storage. So this is just a kind of recap on what I've been saying already. When we're looking at heat, we're obviously looking at things like hybrid heat pumps, district heating, and hydrogen boilers. And we see that by 2050, natural gas will not be used for heating anymore in the UK. So this is also just about the signals that are driving demand in the UK and what we can expect to see in the future. Something that we've been looking at in great interest, with great interest at Renewable UK, is hydrogen and the use of hydrogen for storage and also more generally as an energy vector. I think there's an exciting opportunity for renewable hydrogen in the UK because of the market conditions that I've been describing, and because in the UK, we do have this blueprint for cost reduction, which has come from our expertise in terms of bringing down the costs of offshore wind. So we're already starting to see our members, and we can see this through our project intelligence database, we're starting to see our members investing in co-located hydrogen storage facilities, as well as working with industry, with big industry, to decarbonise that industry's footprint. So, for example, there's a project which is co-run by Ørsted and Phillips 66 refinery, which is looking to produce renewable hydrogen in the Humber region of the UK. So moving on to look at these kind of future opportunities. As we all know, renewable generation can reduce prices or have a downward effect on prices because of the low marginal costs. So flexible technologies and dynamic market tools, as well as that increased demand, will allow players from that. And with the correct options and systems in place, we can see a way more flexible and renewables dominated system being much cheaper in the long term. So again, bringing about these market conditions is really what's going to drive deployment in the UK. So this is just looking then at specifically at vehicle to grid and how what actions need to be taken in order to make what I've been talking about a reality. So on the demand side, smart meter rollout, as well as more incentives for vehicle to grid, as well as rooftop solar, will drive through the market there. And on the supply side, we're looking at co-location of storage and renewables, pumped hydro storage, and renewable hydrogen. Again, just covering renewable hydrogen, which is something that I mentioned earlier. As I mentioned, we were very bullish about the future of renewable hydrogen and that it can become cost competitive with other forms of low carbon fuels within this decade. And I've just used the example there of the project that I was talking about between Ørsted, ITM, who are an electrolyzer manufacturer, and Phillips 66. So looking at the specific and breaking down the pipeline of battery storage, which I was talking about before, you can see that in consented and in planning, there is that 10 gigawatt, sizable 10 gigawatt pipeline of storage. And you can see that overwhelmingly it's battery storage with some pumped hydropower. And then, as I was mentioning, increasingly we're seeing hydrogen projects come through as part of that as well. And we do have particular examples of kind of trailblazer flywheel projects in the UK. There's one that's happening in Scotland at the moment, and that will be absolutely instrumental in helping also manage the variability of renewables. So then just looking at the other policy mechanisms that I think it would be really important to address. Something we're starting to see in the UK now is around smart tariffs. So Octopus Energy are one such company that offer a smart tariff. And they are currently offering incentives to domestic customers on the demand side to have a real impact in managing peak demand and also in reducing peak bills. We also want to see far more action in distribution networks to be able to kind of pass on the benefits of renewable supply to consumers. On the supply side, as I mentioned, there are ancillary service and balancing markets. And what we're starting to see is our members stacking revenues from each of these markets to build an investment and a business case. So whilst perhaps we don't have the specific incentives for storage that were described in some of the US states by the previous speaker, what I hope that you've gathered from this presentation is that in the UK, we have the holistic market conditions that are going to bring about this transition and increase the attractiveness of storage and as also of the UK as a place to invest in. So I'll leave you with the slide which just covers some of our recommendations that we would want to see from the UK government, most of which I've covered already. But really for us, it's about securing that higher level picture and how we're going to decarbonise the heat and transport sectors, which are going to absolutely drive deployment of storage in the UK. And I think, as I mentioned, we're just at the moment in this period of opportunity where investment is attractive because we are in this transition, but we've not yet got to the point where there's so many renewables online that we need urgent solutions. There's time to think about the solutions and time to invest now to really capitalise on that future. So I'll hand back to our chair now, but thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, and I'd be glad to continue the conversation there.
Ms. William, thank you for your in-depth analysis. Right now, I have received a few questions from our audience. Because our time is limited, I will pick 2 questions for Williams. All right? Okay. The first question, you mentioned your members are operate both in UK and across the world, even exporting goods and services to over 37 countries across different sectors of green energy industry. Can you give us more information on the benefits of becoming a member? Do you have any members from Taiwan?
We don't yet have any members specifically from Taiwan, but we'd be absolutely delighted to welcome you into the family. And we have hosted delegations from Taiwan in the past as well. Absolutely. So on the benefits of becoming a member, as I mentioned, we have our own in-house data and analytics and forecasting service, which as a member you get full access to. And that means that you can yourself use our data to run bespoke reports and to find out and research the UK market, as well as to see who has been awarded the major contracts up and down the UK, but also globally. So you would be able to see there who are those market actors who you want to get in touch with. The second thing that we can offer you is access to those contacts. So we can put you in touch specifically with developers, with utility, with procurement managers at the companies that are doing the procurement for particular projects. And then thirdly, we run a huge calendar of events. Normally they're in person and held in the UK, but now they're all going to be available virtually for the next year. So later this year, we're running our Global Offshore Wind Conference, which normally is attended by around 4,000 delegates from across the world. And we've hosted delegations from Taiwan at that event before, but also from China, Japan, etc., and other competitor countries. So this year, as I said, this will be held virtually. And this year it will have a strong focus on energy transition and on flexibility and new technological innovation. So I'd strongly recommend you to attend that event as well. The other thing that you get as a member of Renewable UK is access, as I mentioned, to our policy making, and also a really thorough understanding of what's happening in terms of UK policy, and also helping to form those government contacts, as I mentioned.
Wow, there are a lot of benefits to being a member, so I think a lot of companies will be very interested in. Let's go to the second question. Energy storage plays a vital role in the development of a country's renewable energy targets. Can you share more on energy storage's role in the UK and what business opportunity it has brought about? Are those opportunities for Taiwan battery manufacturers, perhaps for cooperation or becoming suppliers to the UK?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope I've given a flavour of the significant opportunity that's out there in the UK market, both in terms of storage, but in terms of renewables more widely as well. There's huge opportunities, and I think the UK is absolutely at the forefront of this global transition. We're reaching these questions faster than probably anywhere else in the world, and we have a significant amount of renewables deployed, having come from that fossil fuel background. So I think there's huge opportunities for Taiwanese companies who, as we all know, have a great history of innovation and of exporting as well, to get involved in the UK market. And as I mentioned, I'd urge you to make contact with me afterwards, or to come along to one of our events if you would want to know more.
All right, it's really attractive. Thank you, Ms. Williams. The webinar is going to be ended. 再次感谢各位参加今天的研讨会，希望各位都能够有满满的收获。外贸协会在未来2个月，每周四下午3点都会有一系列的疫后市场学的线上研讨会。而下周呢，我们将为各位带来到底是危机还是转机呢？后疫情时代，台湾机械业者在新兴市场的新契机。想在泰国以及印尼拓展市场的机械业者，或者呢是对机械业非常有兴趣的朋友们，都一定要准时锁定哦。最后也别忘了帮我们分享、按赞，还有开启 YouTube 小铃铛。感谢大家的参与，我们下次见，拜拜。